The early previews for Indiana Jones and the Great Circle came out on Monday, and I have done the work for you and watched over a dozen of them, ranging from GameSpot to Jacob Stephans, Open World Games, IGN, Bombastic, VGC, Colt Eastwood, and more, to give you a complete synopsis of what everyone is saying about it. The good, the bad, the uncertain, and we'll be diving into a ton of different elements, from the gameplay to the performances and the more controversial elements such as the open world. So, if you're excited for Indiana Jones and the Great Circle, let me know if these previews got you more excited down in the comment section below. If you're new here, you know what you might want to consider doing, and I hope you enjoy.
All right, pal. You can't sleep here. Who the hell are you?
The most important distinction to make, and what many previewers did clarify, and I think this is a very good thing, is what Indiana Jones and the Great Circle is trying to be versus what it is not. Indiana Jones and the Great Circle is not trying to be Uncharted or Tomb Raider. You're not going to be running around bombastically throwing grenades and bombs and getting increasing levels of ordnance to wipe away every single problem in your path. Indiana Jones presents a much more methodical, and Ryan McCaffrey over at IGN did a good job explaining it, stating that it is an adventure action game, not an action adventure game like the aforementioned titles. Based on the dozen plus previews that I did watch, it seems like an apt description, and it borrows more from older school adventure games than some more recent action adventure focused titles, and ultimately, this is a good thing. A way that several reviewers or previewers commented on Indiana Jones and the Great Circle is by saying that it feels almost like an Indiana Jones simulator, and this is not surprising when you consider that's part of the reason why Machine Games chose to make the game in that first-person perspective. But additionally, when executive producer Todd Howard is sort of leading this project, and we've heard him describe future games such as The Elder Scrolls 6 and his goal for it to be the ultimate fantasy simulation, when he gets a hold of one of his favorite IPs of all time and can make a game about it, trying to make that Indiana Jones simulator doesn't seem as surprising.
It is a mashup. It is a unique, it isn't one thing intentionally. So it does a lot of different things that, you know, myself and Yurik and the folks at Machine Games have wanted to do in a game. So it's a unique thing.
This distinction is likely why some, like VGC, mentioned, quote, "It's not just the Indiana Jones adventure fans have been waiting for 40 years. It's the video game the franchise has truly deserved. Machine Games seems to be a match made in heaven." And others, such as Kinda Funny's Blessing and Tim Geddes, mentioning that they aren't really sure if they want to play through the game after these previews.
I'm coming up very, very negatively on this game, and that's because Tim Geddes, for what I would be looking for from an Indiana Jones game, I am not really getting it from this. And coming out of this demo, maybe jumping ahead a bit, maybe I should say this later in the podcast, but like, great. I'm no longer sure I want to play through this game.
Oh, wow.
And that's
interesting.
That to me is like a bummer, because I was really rooting for this game. And again, not as the biggest Indiana Jones fan, but just as a fan of these type of games traditionally.
Ultimately, it's an alignment of expectations, and I think it's good that these previews came out and are expressing as much. It's not a problem now if some previewers went in and said, actually, this isn't really what I thought it was, and it's not for me. But do be wary if reviews start coming around and people start criticizing it because it doesn't have that heavy action focus. It's sort of, to me, like ordering chocolate ice cream and then complaining why it's not vanilla to the clerk. It just doesn't make any sense. Other important distinctions to note was that the preview took place over about 2 to 3 hours, which definitely is not enough to get your full impressions, your final thoughts on a massive 30+ hour game that this is meant to be. And also, it took place in 3 separate segments that some commented made the experience feel a little bit more disjointed, that systems might have been explained a bit better if you had the opportunity to play through it more cohesively. So, took place in 3 different segments. The first, where Professor Jones teaches at Marshall College. The second took place in a very linear segment in the Vatican. And the third was in an open world or open region area in Giza.
You have is your stupid American cartoons. Choo choo, choo choo. Ha 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 ha. You laugh and dance, celebrating your own idiocy and drinking the piss you call beer. I will walk through fire for the devoted men of the Reich. Give me that stone. Now!
Can't give you what I don't have.
Indiana Jones, despite having a bit of a rocky track record lately, is some pretty big shoes to fill, but previewers near unanimously noted the John Williams score as an absolute highlight, and Troy Baker's performance in particular seems like a match made in heaven. Paris Hilly stated that Troy Baker is Harrison Ford.
It ain't a walk in the park.
Okay, then. Let's see if you can keep up.
What do you mean if I could keep up?
I'd like to imagine some of that Lucasfilm money is really helping provide some state-of-the-art equipment to make this feel like it could be one of the films. Side note, but I would love to see a no-clip documentary about the making of Indiana Jones and the Great Circle, just to see how that partnership with Lucasfilm really did play out. I think that would be so interesting. We can't speak too much to the story, but Machine Games, again, I have always said that I think they're one of the most underrated writers in the industry right now. The Wolfenstein games, both are some of my favorite story-driven first-person shooters. The previews did start off with the big bad guy, or one of them, coming in, breaking into the Marshall College and stealing an artifact that turns out to be the MacGuffin that prompts Indy to go on this adventure. Sets up an interesting enough plot point, but previewers weren't able to dive enough into the story to get a good takeaway from it. First-person combat, pretty solid, pretty satisfying, which is very important as you're going to be running around punching your way through groups of enemies and Nazis taking them down in order to solve the mystery that is the Great Circle. Now, it was emphasized that this is a canonical entry into the Indiana Jones IP, and I certainly think you could see some of the combat and some of the decisions that were made around that play into this. For starters, Indiana Jones is a squishy target. A couple shots and it's lights out for him, but that also works the other way. Enemies are pretty easy to take down, and I personally like this style of difficulty much better than what I've been complaining to Bethesda Game Studios for years about, which is turning up the difficulty simply changes the damage ratios that you take and that you deal. Indiana Jones is a professor, not a fighter, and so he's not going to be able to sustain getting overwhelmed by too many guards at once. Therefore, stealth is your ally, and you do need to make use of things in the environment, typical things you'd expect in a stealth game, like throwing bottles for distractions or sneaking around and using takedowns from behind with anything you can find in the environment, like I mentioned before, frying pans, broomsticks, and anything else you might be able to get your hands on. And Colt Eastwood probably describes some of the first-person combat the best, punching enemies and performing takedowns. If you know Machine Games, you know that they pretty much have this section of it down pat, but you can listen to what Colt Eastwood had to say.
Most of the time, the first-person combat felt very impactful with camera shakes, loud audio cues, and blocks of bone-crunching punches. And in one instance, I punched a guard as he was turning around, and the way his head spun, it looked quite painful, and I had physical reactions in the room while I was playtesting the game.
There were a few that felt as though the first-person combat felt a little bit rigid, a little bit stiff, maybe even claustrophobic, and my expectation, having not played the game, is maybe sort of similar to if you've ever played a game like Red Dead Redemption 2 or Grand Theft Auto 5, and you've sort of punched some of the NPCs switching between first and third person. It can feel a little bit awkward, can feel a little bit different, take some getting used to, but I imagine it's probably in a similar vein there. As for difficulty, most previewers mentioned that if they did try to go in guns blazing, it alerted a lot of guards. They would come over and they would quickly be overrun by just a handful of them. Others I have heard say you can sort of muscle your way through it. Of course, we're not sure exactly what difficulty each of these people were playing on. One in particular, I believe it was Jacob Stephans, had mentioned that he was playing on the normal difficulty, found it too easy to get through enemies, then actually turned it up to one of the harder, and therefore had to think a lot more strategically because you could not play as aggressive. I did also hear in some of the previews that the AI was pretty simplistic in its nature. If you get caught, you hide for a little bit, and instantly or relatively quickly they go back to their patrols as though they never saw anything to begin with. So do with that what you will. They were playing on an older build. It's possible that there's been some AI improvements since the build that they played on. That's why the gameplay footage was actually provided by Bethesda.
And typically guards won't hear you even if you do a big, huge bone-cracking body fall to the ground.
Now, there are other stealth elements present as well. You can pick up bodies and carry them on your shoulder to try to hide them out of sight. Dishonored was brought up quite a few times as what people felt some of the inspiration might be coming from. Also, some other games like Chronicles of Riddick, which isn't a surprise for machine games, but immersive sim elements was a term that frequently came up in people's previews in terms of the versatility as to how you approach certain scenarios within the game, either in combat or just exploration as a whole. Speaking of exploration, this is where things start to get the most mixed as far as how people felt about it. Now, the demo took place over 3 different sections, and generally praised was the first section that took place in Marshall College, which really set the tone of the game, set the scene, provided some story elements, and showed players how to navigate through the world and do some simple things like picking up and putting down objects and solving puzzles. The second section in the Vatican was very story-driven, linear experience, constantly progressing, and a lot of people did love this segment, I would say the most, and it highlights what I personally feel machine games is best at, and that is those story-driven linear segments. The controversial part became the open world or open section of the game that took place in Giza. Some people liked it, some people were not too fond of it for various reasons that we're going to dive into. So first off, the size of the open world segment, some people described it as being big, but not so big it was annoying. Other people just really weren't fond of it. There is a fast travel system to navigate from point to point that can save you minutes of traveling. So it's big enough to incorporate fast travel to make it more convenient for players. Do with that what you will. The open world features a disguise system similar to the Hitman games where you can put on outfits in order to hide or obfuscate yourself from enemies unless you get too close to them, in which case they can spot you. However, Kind of Funny did mention it wasn't really clear who could or couldn't see you, so you sort of just had to guess. And there's plenty of side content and side missions that you can pick up and go off and explore. There's underground temples and ruins and puzzles to go solve that are completely optional. Some of them will provide mission critical elements. It was mentioned how to go through some tombs you would need, for example, a lighter that you find in a completely different location. So that exploration is necessary. And again, it really helps to fill some of that Indiana Jones simulator type feel to it. Paris explicitly mentioned during his demo that there was some frustration when he was not able to progress because you specifically needed this lighter.
See the hole, and I'm like, do I try to go down this hole? And I kept trying to, scale it down, and I would die. But you needed the lighter to light the lamp, and then you keep going, the other way. And there was nothing that was indicating. There wasn't like a friendly audio cue, and there was nothing to say, hey, you're missing something. You need something in this area.
It really does fall back on some of that old school adventure game mentality where you need to explore and find things out on your own. Now, it wouldn't be a proper Indiana Jones experience if you weren't diving into tunes and putting your fingers on every piece of treasure that you could possibly find, and there are different dungeons that you can go off and explore. However, one element of that is, of course, the puzzles, and these also receive some pretty mixed feedback from players. Whether or not that's just because it was too early in the game isn't 100% certain, but a lot of people felt as though they were really too easy. The puzzles were more about just simply looking around and interacting with whatever you could in the environment versus actually using some brain power to solve what's there. Now, this very well could have been a case where Giza's probably one of the first open sections that you're able to go to, some of the first optional puzzles that you're going to experience, and therefore, as you progress through the game, they will get progressively harder. That's what I would hope for, but it does remain to be seen. People want challenging puzzles, and games seem to be a little bit scared of making players feel stupid, but I don't think that's such a bad thing sometimes. Sometimes we are pretty dumb. one of the big concerns that came out for some people who were a little bit more cautious about this demo was how the pacing would work out as you go from these more linear, action-packed set-piece moments to some of these open-world, slower sections where you really are bringing down the pace quite a lot. Is that going to work? Is that going to flow? Again, even I can acknowledge that Machine Games' strength is in those narrative linear segments. Is exploring these open world sections or open areas going to just become more of a nuisance, more of a tedious task and something to check off rather than something that you want to do? Is it really going to halt the pacing and the progression of the story versus keeping things moving? That remains to be seen, but I am ultimately, as usual, pretty optimistic. And again, I think it's important to emphasize that opinions really did stretch on both sides of this spectrum. VGC stated, quote, "The balance of linear and open, combat and puzzles seems to be pitch perfect and feels like an adventure that, were it released as a film in 1987, no one would bat an eye." Some other positive highlights from the demo too was the progression system that Machine Games used. It's pretty cool. Machine Games has never had just a full-on RPG system where you're putting in skill points. This style, you sort of find books in the world, and then by doing various activities such as doing photography and capturing certain landmarks, you gain points that you can then put to unlock these skills. So one that pretty much every single preview mentioned was a bit of a second wind mechanic, where if you do get knocked out, you could look around, find Indiana Jones's hat, pick it back up, and then you get a bit of a second chance. Very Machine Games like. And not a lot of people brought this up. Open World Games did mention it in their preview, but not a lot of people brought this up. It's a feature I love, which is in order to interact with some of the game elements, such as a map, you physically pull out something that you hold in front of your character, and you could still move around the environment while you're looking at it. And I love those types of mechanics. It really helps to keep you in the immersion. And again, it really works towards that Indiana Jones simulator experience because they're trying not to take you out of it too much. Some people have brought up their experience with bugs in the game. I'm not talking about that too much because, again, it's an earlier build. I'm sure there's going to be a lot of polish, and hopefully they're just aware of it and get something clean out the gate across all systems. All in all, the early previews incredibly positive. There were a few here and there that walked away from it saying maybe this isn't the game for me. Again, there's nothing wrong with that. If you don't like chocolate ice cream, don't order chocolate ice cream. I will say, though, I think for a lot of folks, the story is really what's going to push this experience, and previewers did not get to have a good look at that. It's staying under wraps, which I think is the right move, especially because we've seen a lot of that through some of the gameplay trailers that have come out. I'm more excited than I was before. Let me know how you all feel about it. I look forward to hearing your thoughts on Indiana Jones and the Great Circle. And if you liked what you've seen here, consider sticking around, subscribing for more. Thank you all so much for watching. Thank you all so much for watching, and I hope to see you all next time. So long, everybody.